Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the sections of the dance song and of the funeral song in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I also have a discussion of the film 127 Hours to accompany the section of the funeral song. So let's get started. The dance song. One evening, Zarathustra was walking through the forest with his disciples, and he was looking for a well. Behold, he came upon a green meadow, quietly surrounded by trees and bushes. In the meadow, girls were dancing together. As soon as the girls recognized Zarathustra, they ceased their dance. Zarathustra, however, approached them with a friendly air and spoke these words: "Do not cease your dance, sweet girls. No spoiled sport has come to you with an evil eye, no enemy of girls. I am God's advocate with the devil. He, however, is the spirit of gravity. How could I be enemy to divine dancing, you nimble creatures, or to girls' feet with fair ankles? To be sure, I am a forest and a night of dark trees, but he who is not afraid of my darkness will find rose blowers too under my cypresses, and he will surely find too the little god whom girls love best. He lies beside the fountain still with his eyes closed. Truly, he has fallen asleep in broad daylight, the idler. Has he been chasing butterflies too much? Don't be angry with me, fair dancers, if I chastise the little god a little. Perhaps he will cry out and weep, but he is laughable, even in weeping, and with tears in his eyes he shall ask you for a dance, and I myself sing a song for his dance, a dance song and a mocking song on the spirit of gravity, my supreme, most powerful devil, who they say is the Lord of the earth." So this is a strange little section to kick things off as well. You have Zarathustra and his disciples in a forest who suddenly spot a bunch of girls dancing, and then the girls stop dancing, and then Zarathustra's like, "I'm not a spoiled sport at all, keep on dancing," and then he goes and enjoys himself, and we dance with the girls as well. But overall, I think we can say about this strange little section that ultimately it represents the sort of being at one with nature, and dance itself representing the way in which nature dances, as in the wind blowing on the leaves in the trees, the way that waves go in the ocean and so forth, all dancing around, and therefore dance itself and the dance that girls do in the section is ultimately therefore representative of becoming at one with the dance of nature itself, let's say. And we also have quite the interesting line as well: "I'm God's advocate with the devil." And here, especially for Nietzsche, who says God is dead, suddenly we have the line, "I'm God's advocate." It's very almost out of the blue and completely unexpected for you to have, therefore, a person who would say, well, surely somebody who's much more critical of organized religion and Christianity and so forth, this is an unexpected line to appear completely. And then we also have the line as well at the end of this little bit in which he says, "A dance song and a mocking song on the spirit of gravity, my supreme most powerful devil, who they say is the Lord of the earth." Now, Lord of the earth, of course, in the Christian sense, is directly in relation to God. God is Lord of the earth and so on. But we have the apostrophes going around this whole sense of Lord of the earth here, which then goes into the whole idea that God, and the Christian God, is not what Nietzsche is going to be getting at here, but rather the whole relation between nature and relation into divinity. And the more you start to push that, of course, well, what divinity is it that he could possibly mean and have a relation into nature. And one of the big ones, of course, for Nietzsche that pops up, especially as well earlier in his work, that then later, of course, has a great influence as well, as Dionysus. And Dionysus is the ancient Greek god of wine and sex, in which people, quite humorously as well, would go out, get drunk on a Friday night, and then let's say the ancient Greek policemen and so forth try to stop a person, question them. They just say, that's perfectly okay. We'll stop them and question them. And then the response is, I know I've consumed a lot of alcohol. I know I'm almost blackout drunk here, but that's absolutely fine because I was doing it all in the name of worship of Dionysus. And the police would just let them go. They said, good for you. Worship that god. Go for it. And of course, in ancient Greece as well, there's massive sex orgies and so on, all in the name of Dionysus. So whenever you have that relation back into Dionysus, is never normally a good thing. But Nietzsche's whole understanding of Dionysus is to pull out all the joy and affirmation that we have of the world and life itself, and not in the negative sense of just solely a self-destructive aspect of the Dionysian, not solely chaotic, but it's also a sense of within that chaos, life itself allows for a rebirth, creativity to emerge, newness to emerge, and so on. And so it's not in the sense of an individualistic sense either, in which Dionysus is really in the sense of the worldly forces as well that affect how we think about things, rather than us having control over them. There's rather all these external forces, let's say historically, politically, in terms of social and cultural norms, all having an effect upon how we think, rather than us trying to determine and control everything around us. That would be very Dionysian as well. So we have that sort of Dionysian aspect, let's say, popping out first. A love of the world, love of forces affecting us, and us sort of becoming at once within this great dance of nature, enjoyment of life itself. Continuing on then, and this is the song Zarathustra sang as Cupid and the girls danced together. Lately I looked into your eye, O life, and I seemed to sink into the unfathomable. But you pulled me out with a golden rod. You laughed mockingly when I called you unfathomable. All fish talk like that, you said. What they cannot fathom is unfathomable. But I am merely changeable and untamed, and in everything a woman, and no virtuous one. Although you men call me profound or faithful, eternal, mysterious, but you men always endow us with your own virtues. Ah, you virtuous men. Thus she laughed, the incredible woman. But I never believe her and her laughter when she speaks evil of herself. And when I spoke secretly with my wild wisdom, she said to me angrily, you will, you desire, you love, that is the only reason you praised life. Then I almost answered crossly and told the truth to my angry wisdom. And one cannot answer more crossly than when one tells the truth to one's wisdom. This is then the state of affairs between us three. From the heart of me, I love only life, and in truth, I love her most of all when I hate her. But that I am fond of wisdom, and often too fond, is because she very much reminds me of life. She has her eyes, her laughter, and even her little golden fishing rod. How can I help it that they both look so alike? And when life once asked me, who is she then, this wisdom? Then I said eagerly, ah yes, wisdom. One thirsts for her and is not satisfied. One looks at her through veils, one snatches at her through nets. Is she fair? I know not, but the cleverest old fish are still lured by her. She is changeable and defiant, and I've often seen her bite her lip and comb her hair against the grain. Perhaps she is wicked and false, and in everything a wench. But when she speaks ill of herself, then precisely is she most seductive. When I said this to life, she laughed maliciously and closed her eyes. But whom are you speaking of? She asked. Of me, surely. And if you are right, should you tell me that to my face? But now speak of your wisdom too. Ah, and then you opened your eyes again, O beloved life, and again I seemed to sink into the unfathomable. Thus sang Zarathustra, but when the dance had ended and the girls had gone away, he grew sad. The song has long since set, he said at last. The meadow is damp, coolness is coming from the forests. Something strange and unknown is about me, looking thoughtfully at me. What? Are you still living, Zarathustra? Why? Wherefore? Whereby? Whither? Where? How? Is it not folly to go on living? Ah, my friends, it is the evening that questions thus within me. Forgive my sadness. Evening has come, forgive me that has become evening. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Then when we get into the main chunk of this section, then we have the split into two. One discussion of life and another discussion of wisdom. So firstly then, dealing with life, he says life is something that's changeable, untamed, woman-like, and not virtuous. And so it's quite easy to get into the examples for that. Of course, changeable, the whole idea of a life cycle, life and death, continual change. Of course, seasons is a fantastic example as well. Something is untamed because it's wild. Woman-like is really interesting as well, to say, well, life is woman-like. And also we have this sense of people like to attribute the world itself as being like a woman, in the sense of we can have, well, how is it woman-like? Let's say perhaps the metaphor that he wants to draw upon is the way in which you allow for all the aspects of creation and life itself to take place. But also from Nietzsche, he also has the aspect of women being quite scornful and hateful at the same time. And so within the midst of all that, you can say, well, there is the aspect of life and creation, but within the very context of life, we also have death. And then we go into the ethical aspect of it to say, well, life itself isn't something that's virtuous in any given way, because there is no model by which you can say it's either good or bad in itself. Let's use the example of a tiger. You can't say that a tiger is evil because it kills, for instance, because it kills in order to live. And what you've ultimately done by saying the act of murder that a tiger has committed is wrong is actually not the tiger's problem, but actually the human construct we have applied to it, that we then say it's because of our own construct and our own ethical model we could say murder is wrong. But then the tiger itself isn't actually doing anything wrong whatsoever. It's doing what it needs to survive. In the same sense of we can say natural disasters are horrible, but in itself you could say, well, there's nothing virtuous about what's going to happen within nature. There's no sense of an ethical model. Everything's out for, of course, survival of the fittest, horrible natural disasters and so forth occurring, and so on. And what's interesting is this whole sense of everything having a sense of being sort of unfathomable here as well, as he says. When you think about life, you seem to think into the unfathomable. And then, of course, life laughs at him and then says, all fish talk like that. What they cannot fathom is unfathomable. And it's sort of making the joke as well, as whenever we can't make sense of something and whenever we can't immediately understand it, and then we just suddenly say, well, that's completely out of my reach altogether, therefore I don't understand it. And then you, of course, can go into perhaps what Nietzsche's touching upon here, the way in which gods are created in the very first place. When life is unfathomable, then, at least traditionally, the unfathomable is attributed to the idea of a god. What creates the tidal waves? What is the thing that causes heat and everything in the world and so on? All collection of God in a monotheistic sense, or perhaps it's polytheism and multiple gods all causing things within the world. But then we have the whole idea of wisdom attached to life, because then suddenly in comes men, he says, and then suddenly, quite like how we have the idea of the tiger is an unethical thing because it kills, is precisely that idea of life itself, nature, and the world is burdened through the attachment of our own models and the way in which we view things onto life itself. It's that whole aspect of life is inseparable from wisdom, and that whole sort of intertwining of the fact that how do we view life is precisely through the models and structures of knowledge that ultimately we're brought up with in the first place and learn through education. But is that actually representative of the world itself? Or is it not? The structure itself, is it not the model? And it's sort of this whole intertwining and inseparability between life and how we view life that really comes out in this section. Because on the other hand, he says, well, wisdom is something that we seek, something that we thirst after, and something that's, again, changeable and also defiant, in a sense of, well, everybody seeks after knowledge, and it's like a thirst as well. So it's not only sense of wanting to know, but ultimately wanting to quench your thirst and have that really satisfying read or answering your question, and that yes moment in which you finally crack whatever problem it is. And it's also an interesting thing in say, well, knowledge and wisdom is something that's changeable, like life is not something that's static based upon completely eternal, unchangeable, immovable structures, but these structures themselves are subject to change, which is a big thing to say when dealing with philosophy as a subject, because at least traditionally within philosophy, the whole idea of change is something that's argued to be monstrous. It's a great idea in Plato, and the whole idea of just change being this monstrous thing, because it precisely eats away at any form of stability whatsoever. How could you understand things if suddenly everything changes all the time? It just constantly eat away at it, eat away at it. I need to establish a form of stability here. How do we do this? And that's the sort of questions that drive traditionally philosophy in order to try to get to those bases. And then, of course, you get into the whole idea of defiance and wanting to defend those structures of knowledge as well, and having not only a person create the structure, but also the followers of said structure or idea to then back up whoever it is that's arguing for it in the first place, is those defiant people that are against the very idea of change, and knowledge should always be static because I think this person is absolutely right, and therefore I'm going to follow them down to the T and argue for their position. Thank you very much. And of course, you can just go into the various different schools of thought within philosophy, at least in a historical sense as well. Plato and his followers, Aristotle and his followers, and then you move into, let's say, the 20th century. Then you can have, the modern school of phenomenology, as it's called, and you have Edmund Husserl is the big figure at that, and then who's a couple of followers of him is Sartre and Heidegger. And so there's that constantly sense of people creating structures, but also the sense of new structures emerging, and also the fact there's always going to be those people that are going to be there to argue for and defend the model and the system that's created in the first place. And so there's that whole intertwining between life and wisdom in the sense of they both share the same ideas of being changeable. That's they're not fixed in any given way, that they both have the relation into creativity and wanting new things to emerge, and so in a way they're a bit wild. And so what is really interesting, if you push it even further, is another distinction that Nietzsche makes, is he says life itself is never evil, like we said with the tiger example, and it also says the line as well. Thus she laughed, the incredible woman, but I never believe her and her laughter when she speaks evil of herself. So it's the whole sense of in which you could say, well, even if you said that the act in nature was evil in itself, nature is something that's very much a neutral thing. On the other hand, then, we have wisdom being seductive when it speaks ill of itself, which is a very, very interesting idea, because then we have seeping in the whole idea, well, life itself is something that's neutral. How we view things of life is based upon a structure in which we think about life itself. And then the way in which we start to say, well, how do we move into an idea about change? How do we view knowledge itself as a mode of seduction and being seduced? Why do we believe what we believe? Surely there has to be a level of seduction at work there. And the whole sense of being enticed in the very first place by, let's say, the rhetoric or the style in which it's written or the grandiose structure that it's built upon and so forth, taken aback and mesmerized by all the things that's happening, or maybe just taken aback by how simple it is and so on. All the different ways in which somebody could be seduced when they're reading philosophy. And there's also the other things as well. We could be seduced, and that's what's so good about advertising, of course, an example. They want to seduce you in order to buy the products in the first place. There's the whole sexual element of food. When you go into the whole aspect of, wouldn't this be absolutely gorgeous and tasty? Don't you want to eat this? And it's the whole aspect of, yes, I do want to eat this. I want you in my mouth right now. I'm going to eat you and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. And you're going to be in my tummy and it's going to feel good. And so what's interesting is not only do we have the relation to seduction and knowledge, but also then a sense of, well, when we're seduced, we believe whatever the person is that's telling us is the truth because we're seduced by what they say. And then comes in the whole point to say, well, what they could be seducing you and you've been drawn in with it, of course, is a completely harmful, poisonous idea. And it's something that's not good for you whatsoever. And of course, you can go into great rhetoricians in history and people being sucked in by great speeches and and why are they believing exactly what they say? Because they're all seduced by it. And that's one of the ways in which evil is at work. Because we don't realize what actually the people are saying in the first place is harmful for us. What we believe, in fact, is really good. We love it, in fact. We love the fact that the Big Mac looks so good. Tastes amazing as well. Just even the recollection of the taste of the Big Mac. You want the Big Mac. But of course, is it something that's good for you? Of course, it is good for you based on the whole thing as long as you do a balanced diet and all the nutritional information that goes for it. But when you go into the deeper whole level about politics, then it goes into say, well, what happens when a populace is seduced by whoever it is that's talking? What happens then? And so it's a really great section, despite it throwing us off a little bit by the use of language as well and the metaphors that kicks off the section. Because one of the main things you can take away from this as well is what is Nietzsche trying to say is how do we understand things is precisely through the structures of thought. And of course, these structures are things that we learn, that we're brought up with in our society, in our culture. These things change over time, of course. They're not something that's static. And what is so important about them, of course, is that they precisely affect how we think and how we think about precisely the world and everything in it. And also we can say, well, the section sort of wraps up on the whole idea of the unfathomable and things being unknown. And sort of Zarathustra being a little bit sad and it becoming night again and so on. But you could say, well, the unknown is something that always can make us a bit sad about, like, I don't know this, But it's in the sense that also the unknown is really a driving force within knowledge as well. Or it's the whole idea of, well, what we thought we knew is to be true and what we've believed to be true, but actually now it's unknown. And then, yeah, it's kind of sad because we've lost a specific way of thinking about things and a whole, let's say, decades of different people all arguing for a position. And it's quite sad when we lose that whole aspect of doing things. But also, isn't it really good at the end of the day that we can sort of like draw the curtains on forms of knowledge and structures of thought, and let's say allowing night to happen over certain ones, and therefore allowing day to go upon new forms of knowledge and different ideas, and allowing for all those wonderful things to happen again. That's really what Nietzsche is saying here, is one of the reasons why we've become so defiant is because we almost have this beautiful sense of wanting to hold on to things because they've meant so much to us. And it's that whole idea again in a previous section of, well, it's okay to let go because we can hold on to, like, say, our seashells at the beach, like he says, but once you let them go, there's always those new seashells that come in. And isn't that a wonderful thing? We have the new ones. Moving on to the next section, the funeral song. Yonder is the grave island, the silent island. Yonder too are the graves of my youth. I will bear thither an evergreen wreath of life. Resolving thus in my heart, I fared over the sea. O you sights and visions of my youth! O all you glances of love! You divine momentary glances! How soon you perished! Today I think of you as my dead ones. A sweet odor comes to me from you, my dearest dead ones. A heart-easing odor that banishes tears. Truly, it moves and eases the solitary seafarer's heart. Still am I the richest and most to be envied man. I, the most solitary, for I had you, and you have me still. Tell me, to whom have such rosy apples fallen from the tree as have fallen to me? Still I am heir and heritage of your love, blooming to your memory with many-colored wild-growing virtues, O my most beloved ones. Ah, we were made for one another, you gentle, strange marvels, and you came to me, and my longing not as timid birds. No, you came trusting to me, who also trusted. Yes, made for faithfulness like me, and for tender eternities. Must I now name you by your unfaithfulness, you divine glances and moments? I have as yet learned no other name. Truly you perished too soon, you fugitives. Yet you did not fly from me, nor did I fly from you. We are innocent towards one another in our unfaithfulness. They put you to death, you songbirds of my hopes, in order to kill me. Yes, the arrows of malice were always directed at you, my beloved ones, in order to strike at my heart. And they struck. You are always my heart's dearest, my possession, and my being possessed. Therefore, you had to die young and all too early. They shot the arrow at the most vulnerable thing I possessed, and that was you, whose skin is like down and even more like the smile that dies at a glance. But I will say this to my enemies: what is any manslaughter compared with what you did to me? You did a worse thing to me than any manslaughter. You took from me the irretrievable. Thus I speak to you, my enemies. You murdered my youth's visions and my dearest marvels. You took from me my playfellows, those blessed spirits. To their memory do I lay this wreath and this curse. This curse upon you, my enemies. You have cut short my eternity, as a note is cut short in the cold night. It came to me hardly as the twinkling of divine eyes, as a moment. Thus, in a happy hour, my purity once spoke. All creatures shall be divine to me. Then you surprise me with foul phantoms. Alas, whither has that happy hour fled now? All days shall be holy to me. Thus the wisdom of my youth once spoke, truly the speech of a joyful wisdom. But then you, my enemies, stole my nights from me and sold them to sleepless torment. Alas, whither has that joyful wisdom fled now? Alas, whither has that joyful wisdom fled now? Once I longed for happy bird auspices, then you led an owl monster across my path, an adverse sign. Alas, whither did my tender longings flee then? So what initially then kicks off this section of the funeral song is exactly what is it in lament towards, what exactly is the point of the funeral in the first place, and it's towards Zarathustra's own youthful aspirations and youthful dreams are now gravestones that he has to lament over. And it's that whole idea of, as well, that our youthful aspirations and dreams for things in the world as well all exist in a very sort of idealistic state, and also the possibility that anything is potentially possible, that sort of naivety we have in youth, let's say, and the joy as well in our own naivety about things in the world, and that we have potentially no harness on us whatsoever and want to reach for the stars, and all that brings us, of course, endless joy in thinking there's absolutely nothing that's going to hinder us in any given way. And it's like what he says there, you suckle upon the very fruits of your own ideas. And it's the whole sense as well as that in this sort of idealistic, youthful bubble that we have, then we have this sort of state of creativity and joy in creation, and precisely not being burdened in any given way by anybody's trying to tell us that we can't do it in any way whatsoever, or there are any restrictions on us at all. And then this is contrasted, of course, with the very idea, well, these youthful aspirations are going to die. And then is the whole lament of in not actually having achieved your youthful aspirations in the first place, or whatever your dream is to go and aspire towards, to go and chase it. Now it lays in its own little grave. Continuing on then, I once vowed to renounce all disgust. Then you transformed my kindred and neighbours into abscesses. Alas, whither did my noblest vow flee then? Once as a blind man I walked on happy paths. Then you threw filth in the blind man's path, and now the old footpath disgusts him. And when I achieved my most difficult task and celebrated the victory of my overcomings, then you made those whom I loved cry out that I hurt them the most. Truly all that was your doing. You embittered my finest honey and the industry of my finest bees. You have always sent the most insolent beggars to my liberality. You have always crowded the incurably shameless around my pity. Thus you have wounded my virtue's faith, and when I brought my holiest thing as a sacrifice, straightway your piety placed its fatter gifts beside it. So my holiest thing choked in the smoke of your fat. And once I wanted to dance as I had never yet danced. I wanted to dance beyond all heavens. Then you lured away my favorite singer. And then he struck up a gruesome, gloomy melody. Alas, he trumpeted into my ears like a mournful horn. Murderous singer, instrument of malice, most innocent man. I stood prepared for the finest dance, and then you murdered my ecstasy with your tones. I know how to speak the parable of the highest things only in the dance, and now my greatest parable has remained in my limbs unspoken. My highest hope has remained unspoken and unachieved, and all the visions and consolations of my youth are dead. How did I endure it? How did I recover from such wounds? How did I overcome them? How did my soul arise again from these graves? Yes, something invulnerable, unburiable is within me, something that rends rocks. It is called my will. Silently it steps and unchanging through the years. It shall go its course upon my feet, my old will. Hard of heart and invulnerable is its temper. I am invulnerable only in my heels. You live there and are always the same, most patient one. You will always break out of all graves. In you too still live on the unachieved things of my youth. And you sit as life and youth, hopefully, here upon yellow grey ruins. Yes, you are still my destroyer of all graves. Hail my will. And only where there are graves are there resurrections. Thus sang Zarathustra. So we have then the continual and repeated theme of that when anything positive happens, something negative then destroys any sense of positivity that's tried to be created in the first place. And it's that whole examples that he gives of taking away his joyful wisdom as well as his youthful visions for things, how he'd like things to be in his youth, as well as he says when he was a blind man, that is to say before he becomes more philosophical about things and adopts a more critical approach to life, that ultimately filth is thrown in front of his path. And then perhaps one of the most fantastic examples as well, when we have the section that says, I wanted to dance as I've never yet danced before. I wanted to dance beyond all heavens. Then you lured away my favorite singer. And it's the whole idea there of you want to have that whole joyful dancing with the world, with nature, with life itself. And then you took that away. Now what I'm left with is a very bleak, pessimistic outlook on things, because now we have the singer, of course, transformed, no longer affirming life, the world, but precisely a melancholic view of things. Is that fantastic line, you murdered my ecstasy with your tones? It's just, you could imagine just that sense in which you're just peacefully trying to almost get to sleep, and then you suddenly hear a screeching cat fight outside the window and just like, no. And it's a sense there as well in which you have in Nietzsche this whole sense of joyfulness, this whole sense of creativity emerging forth, always to be stifled, always to be taken away, always to have to really eke out an existence for yourself, because everything in life continually just puts you down all the time. And then of course that's why we get into the important last little section about the will and perseverance and really driving to survive as well, all coming out as such a big idea in this whole section, to say, well, why is this the case? Because life is horrible. Life just continually always puts you down, and that's why you've got to keep on struggling. That's why you've got to just keep on going. And what's an example of that we have, he turns to the whole idea of the will. And so of course it comes from the idea from Schopenhauer with will with a big capital W, in which we have the sort of pre-Darwinian idea as well of this whole bodily striving and bodily life force within us that keeps us ticking. And here's a little quick summation of the will from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's little section on Schopenhauer's will. As it states, Schopenhauer philosophizes within the spirit of the tradition of German idealism, for he believes that the supreme principle of the universe is likewise apprehensible through introspection, and that we can understand the world as various manifestations of this general principle. For Schopenhauer, this is not the principle of self-consciousness and rationally infused will, but is rather what he simply calls will with a capital W, a mindless, aimless, non-rational impulse at the foundation of our instinctual drives and at the foundational being of everything. Schopenhauer's originality does not reside in his characterization of the world as will or as act, for we encounter this position in Fichte's philosophy, but in the conception of will as being devoid of rationality or intellect. And so in Schopenhauer, this whole idea of blind striving to exist within us is not only the thing, of course, that keeps us going, but also leads us to have this whole sense of suffering and as well as a war of all against all, because ultimately everything is a manifestation of our desires and therefore a manifestation of our will, and therefore we have the whole pessimistic outlook that all what we want to do is ultimately have a continual cyclical idea of trying to struggle against others for our own survival and also struggling against others for what we can also attain. As it says again here in the encyclopedia little part on Schopenhauer, it says, Schopenhauer maintains in The World as Will and Representation, which is his big book, that we create the violent state of nature, for his view is that the individuation we possess upon things is imposed upon a blind striving energy that once it is individuated and objectifies, turns against itself, consumes itself, and does violence to itself. His paradigm image is that of a bulldog ant of Australia that, when cut in half, struggles in a battle to the death between its head and tail. Our very quest for scientific and practical knowledge creates, for Schopenhauer, sinfully and repulsively, a world that feasts nightmarishly upon itself. And this marks the origin of Schopenhauer's renowned pessimism. He claims that as individuals we are the anguished products of our own epistemological making. That is the posh word for philosophy of knowledge right there. And that within the world of appearances that we structure, we are fated to fight with other individuals and want more than we can ever have. On Schopenhauer's view, the world of daily life is essentially violent and frustrating. It's a world that, as long as our consciousness remains at the level where the principle of sufficient reason applies in its fourfold root, that's just a very simple thing. The principle of sufficient reason is really easy to understand. It's just that in order for anything to exist, it has to have a reason for its existence. It will never resolve itself into a condition of greater tranquility. As he explicitly states, daily life is suffering, and to express this, he employs images of frustration taken from classical Greek mythology. So, on the other hand, then, for Nietzsche, he takes this idea of will and he twists it and removes any sense of it being pessimistic. Because you could say, on the one hand, like, yes, you have this whole Schopenhauer aspect of it, of course, but then Nietzsche's like, well, no. Because this whole sense of blind striving doesn't make us unhappy. It's actually the driving force within all things in the first place, but also it's a driving force or a will to life, as he says, because it's precisely the thing, as he says, that is a life force within us that is going to take care of us, heal us whenever we cut ourselves, body sorting itself out when we get ill, and so on. It's not just this solely thing that's always going to lead us into a whole idea of suffering all the time. In fact, it can be a very positive thing for us. And Nietzsche's whole idea of will is normally called as will to power, of course, which has got nothing to do with power whatsoever or trying to acquire power in a political sense, but rather should be thought in terms of this whole will to life and the struggling to survive and the whole perseverance in the face of precisely adversity itself. And what a great movie example as well to back up Nietzsche's argument in this section is the movie 127 Hours. So let's have a little discussion of the plot from his Wikipedia page. In April 2003, mountaineer Aaron Ralston goes hiking at Utah's Canyonlands National Park. He befriends hikers Christy and Megan and shows them an underground pool. After swimming, Aaron parts ways with the hikers and continues through a slot canyon in Blue John Canyon. While climbing, he slips and falls, knocking over a boulder which crushes his right hand and wrist against the wall. He calls for help but realizes that he is alone. Ralston begins recording a video diary to maintain morale as he chips away part of the boulder to try and free himself and tries to keep warm at night. He rations his food and water to try to survive the ordeal. He sets up a pulley using his climbing rope in a futile attempt to climb the boulder. Over the next 5 days, Ralston tries using his pocket knife to cut himself free, but the blade is too dull to cut bone. With no water available, he is forced to drink his urine. In his videos, he becomes desperate and depressed. He hallucinates about escape, relationships, and past experiences, including a former lover, family, and Christy and Megan. During one hallucination, he realizes that his mistake was that he did not tell anyone where he was going, and decides that destiny has trapped him with the boulder. On the 6th day, Ralston has a vision of his future son, spurring his will to survive. He fashions a tourniquet from camelback tube insulation and uses a carabiner to tighten it. Then, using his knowledge of torque, he breaks the bone in his arm and, using the pocket knife, slowly amputates it. He wraps the stump to prevent exsanguination and takes a picture of the boulder. He then rappels down a 65-foot rock face using his other arm and drinks rainwater from a pond. He meets a family on a hike who alerts the authorities, and a Utah Highway Patrol helicopter brings him to a hospital. Years later, Ralston starts a family, continues climbing, and always leaves a note to say where he's gone. So 127 hours, absolutely amazing film as well. And of course, everything hinges upon that really harrowing moment, and horrifying as well when he actually breaks his arm to escape the situation that he's got himself into. But what we can say on the Nietzsche level here, we have a perfect example precisely of when we see the whole will to life, our will to survive at work. Because life has ultimately thrown Aaron Ralston a complete horrible curveball, if you want to put it that way, in which he's in an absolutely terrible situation. And of course, a lot of people could have just been in the canyon and died through having not actually took the actions that he did, of course. But it's the whole point as well, isn't it? Well, would we actually initially think, now, given the circumstances, if I put myself in his place, could I actually have the absolute power and my own mindset to be able to do that? And of course, initially, everybody always goes, no way. But given the circumstances, of course, pushed to the extreme, would we be more capable of things that we actually didn't realize that we're capable of in the first place? What is exactly the thing that's pushing us in the first place? Is that whole sense of bodily will to live, will to survive. That goes over and above all sense of everything else when it comes down to it. And so you could say, well, on the one hand, there's all that sense of suffering that goes on. It's horrible, it's horrifying. But on the other hand, for the whole Nietzsche argument as well, is to say, well, yes, it was a horrible thing that happened, but also through that whole situation and the whole horrible thing that happened, he actually grew as an individual and actually was able to live his life and then live it to an extent fuller than what he had done previously. And so really you could say for this section, one of the main things that we get out of it is the importance of perseverance, our own will to live precisely, in the whole sense of life's hardships that can continually just beat us down, especially in a day-to-day basis, continually just pounding away at us to the extent, of course, that we just get completely depressed. But that's the whole point in which Nietzsche says as well. Throughout all that, we have our struggling to survive, and it's through all that struggling that sort of mimics, in a much more grander way, of course, than just specific movie example, the way in which we go through life itself as one big struggle against a hardship and struggle in order to try to achieve whatever we want to do. But it's that whole point as well, that continual sense of needing to struggle and continual sense of perseverance that comes out of it. So it's really quite an uplifting section, despite the title of it being funeral song. On the one hand, it's the lament and loss, but it's also the sense of, well, don't forget to fight for your ideas and your opinions. Never let everybody just get you down. And never let life itself get you down. Always keep fighting. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the sections, the dance song and the funeral song in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/dissecting philosophy. Also, feel free to drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. And I can also be found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.